I'm a big believer in karmic capitalism, which means what goes around comes around. And at the end of the day, you want to win, but you also want to recognize that there's a short-term win and there's a long-term win. And you want both if you can.
I'm Stan Christensen, and this is All Things Negotiation. Today, my guest is Chip Conley. Chip is a friend. I've known him for over 20 years, and we've been trying to schedule this for some time now. He's an amazing person. He's had 3 different successful entrepreneurial efforts. The first was creating the Joie De Vivre hotel chain, which is one of the leading boutique hotel chains in the 90s and 2000s. He was one of the early Airbnb employees and really helped propel that company and act as sort of the Secretary of State or senior statesman there. And then finally, he created the Modern Elder Academy, which he currently runs, which is a center in Baja California, Santa Fe, New Mexico, where he does education and kind of life planning for the next stage of life for people that are midlife and beyond. I think you're really going to enjoy the conversation. Chip Conley, welcome to All Things Negotiation.
Stan, it's great to be back with you.
It's been so many years since we've known each other. I think we first met over 20 years ago. You were doing the Joie De Vivre hotel chain. I had you come speak in my class at Stanford, and the students thought you were amazing then, and you're going to be even more amazing now. So I'm amazed that people tend to come back around in my life. And one of the principles I teach about negotiation is that think of people as long-term players in your life. They're going to come back around. Is that your experience as well?
Yeah, I'm a big believer in karmic capitalism, which means what goes around comes around. And you know what that means in negotiations or relationships is at the end of the day, you want to win, but you also want to recognize that there's a short-term win and there's a long-term win, and you want both if you can. And the short-term win in which the other party feels like they lost and maybe they felt disrespected, if they're going to be in your life, and they will be because they are going to have an effect on your reputation, the short-term win without the long-term consideration it usually means that karma comes back to bite you on the rear end.
Yeah, that's my experience. I'm glad you brought up reputation. It's one of the few things, as you know, that's portable in life. And so if you can have a good reputation, you can really get some good things done. Well, let's dive in. You've done so much. You really changed your identity, I would say, 3 different times in your career, innovated in all 3 areas. While you were doing that, you wrote many books. You've got an excellent podcast. There's just few people that have been more prolific. So I just want to see how many things we can pull out in this hour. And let's start with your founding of the Joie De Vivre hotel chain, one of the preeminent boutique hotel chains in the country. How in the world did you decide to start a hotel chain? Was that your dream as you were a child?
Actually, my dream as a child, I was born 5 miles from Disneyland in Orange County, California. And I used to draw theme parks. So the idea of creating some kind of experience-driven real estate has always been there in me. And then in college at Stanford undergrad and then Stanford Business School, I focused on real estate. I went to work for a real estate developer out of Stanford Business School in San Francisco. So the idea of the physical real estate has always been there. But it wasn't until a guy named Bill Graham, a concert promoter, a famous concert promoter.
And just for our younger listeners, I mean, Bill Graham is a legend to people in our generation, but just characterize who Bill Graham was, because most people did not get a chance to meet Bill.
Yeah, he was based in San Francisco, but his origin story comes from New York, and he's sort of a hard driving, tough negotiating concert promoter, but who also represented as an agent manager some bands as well. So he created the Fillmore in San Francisco, then the Fillmore East in New York, and was just probably in the 70s, 80s, 70s and 80s, and then maybe the 90s, probably the preeminent concert promoter in the U.S. So he was a guy that it was based in San Francisco. The CEO of my company, the company I was working for, the real estate company, wanted us to be Bill Graham's joint venture partner to build the Shoreline Amphitheater in Mountain View, California. And to be honest with you, Bill didn't need us. Bill Graham didn't need us. And so here I am, a 25-year-old young dude trying to negotiate with one of the toughest negotiators in the world, Bill Graham. And At some point, Bill said, listen, just let's be clear. Yeah, I don't need you. We don't need to negotiate. But here's what you do need to think about. You and your company should create a rock and roll hotel in San Francisco, because I bring bands to town all the time. There's not really a place, a cool, hip place for them to stay. And so that's what you should do. So I went back to the head of our company and I said, like, we're not going to get this Roland Amphitheater joint venture done, but maybe we should do a hotel. And the guy said in my company, the CEO said, like, we are not getting in the hotel business. That if you want to be a billionaire, the fastest way to become a millionaire is to go into the hotel business and the restaurant business. And so I decided to do it on my own. And I finished the business plan at age 26 on my 26th birthday. And 2 months later, I literally owned and I raised $1.1 million from investors to buy a 44-room motel in the Tenderloin that was famous for its hourly rates.
Wow.
And I called it the Phoenix, and spent $200,000 renovating it. Next thing I knew, I was in the hotel business with a rock and roll hotel that became quite famous.
Tell us a story or two about some of the guests. I know that you and I have talked over the years about some of the bands that were there. They tend to be fairly demanding. Any negotiations with bands that stayed in the hotel?
Yeah, in the early days, trying to convince people to, that we were a reputable place for bands to stay meant travel agents needed to, believe in us, and the venues needed to believe in us. But more than anything, the tour manager needed to believe in us. And so when we were negotiating with Linda Ronstadt's people, Linda Ronstadt had a tour called Canciones de Mi Padre, the songs of my father. It was a mariachi tour. And so we were negotiating with her team. And what I heard was like, wow, the tour manager is the big decision maker here. And so I came up with an idea. We had one of the guest rooms in the hotel we had converted into a massage studio. I said to the tour manager, I said, listen, if you sign up with us, you contract with us, the masseuse will give you a free massage every day. And that was really, this was a big deal because they were taking the hotel for 2 weeks and taking every guest room. And so it was a big piece of business. And all I had to do for the negotiation was to offer something that was sort of a hierarchy of needs of what the tour manager needs, because frankly, the tour managers tend to be very stressed out. And it went so well that they came back a year later and took over the hotel again for 2 weeks. And the only thing they put in the contract, in the rider, that was unusual was this idea of like, hey, yeah, the tour manager gets this free massage every day. So, I think if there's a lesson in that is that there's often some kind of unrecognized need that a decision maker in a negotiation has. And part of our job is to be the pop psychologist or mind reader to understand who the decision maker is, first of all. And a lot of people would have said, oh, the decision maker is the travel agent, or it's the Linda Ronstadt's manager, but not the tour manager. And as it turns out, it was a lesson for me, and it led to us doing a big promotion to tour managers all over the United States. Everybody would show up in their tour bus, and the next thing I knew, the first thing they did, the tour manager said, at the front desk when they arrived, was like, "Where's the massage room?"
Oh, I love that story. I mean, negotiation really is creative problem solving. And people often ask me, what does it take to be a great negotiator? One of the answers I give is thinking outside the box. Mm-hmm. It's not just tactical. It's not just hammering on the same points. It's getting people to see something different. And in this case, gosh, I mean, if you got them for 2 weeks, and a lot of other bands probably followed them, tour manager is a decision maker. Often we're dealing with the wrong decision maker. In my career, so often I've negotiated a deal and we're at the 1 yard line and they say, well, let me take this back to my superior or my boss. And I thought, oh my gosh, if I would have known that you weren't the decision maker, I would have approached it very differently.
Yeah.
And so that's just such a useful lesson.
My father used to say to me, negotiate without full authority. And whether you are transparent about that or not he said it's a great negotiating tool, because you're going to negotiate a deal. And then if you don't have full authority, even if you do, you have a day or two to either present it to whoever does have the full authority, or to mull it over to decide, do I like the deal I negotiated here? I don't have to decide here. So I literally this week that we're actually recording this episode, I am selling a home in Santa Fe. We have, we'll talk about the Modern Elder Academy, but I have a home right next to our campus. We have a 2,600 acre campus. And I'm selling a home and have been negotiating that while I am buying 2 other homes right next to the campus as well. So I am in the midst of dealing with 3 different people, a buyer and 2 sellers, and looking at what is the unrecognized need I can address. And just this morning, I was over at the home that I'm selling. And at this point, this is no longer a negotiating thing. It's more just a long-term reputational thing. But I know there's 2 pieces of art that the buyer of that home really likes. And I've decided to leave these 2 pieces of art for her because I think she would really appreciate it. So it's a little bit of a negotiating thing because quite frankly, when a buyer comes in and they move into the home, they have buyer's remorse. And sometimes they'll say like, oh, well, you know what, I need to go back to you and get a credit for this or that. After you've moved in, you usually don't get much of a credit. But in this case, it was, again, karmic capitalism.
Love that. I think in negotiation, there are often opportunities like the art example that you brought up to do something that helps the other side, but doesn't hurt you too much. And if we can just recognize that there's an asymmetry of interests, they might care more about those paintings that you do. And so when you see her in the coffee shop in a year, that's what she's going to remember. Probably more than how much she paid for the house. So I think that's a brilliant strategy. But you're 26, you're starting a hotel chain. That seems like a stretch. I mean, talk about risk. Did you think, oh my gosh, I'm taking a big risk? Because as I counsel young people, I think people often don't take enough risk. And in your career, you've not been afraid of risk. So what have you learned about taking risk?
Well, there are decisions you make that are either above the waterline or below the waterline. And what I mean by that is, if you have a boat and you're making a decision and the decision is going to lead to a torpedo coming towards you. If the torpedo is below the waterline, you got to be very careful about that decision, because a below the waterline decision with a torpedo means your boat sinks. But if it's an above the waterline decision and the torpedo does hit your boat, in either case, it's not assured that the torpedo is going to hit your boat. But if it's an above the waterline decision, your boat will be disfigured, but it's not going to sink.
Right.
So when I try to look at decisions I'm making and the risk associated, I try to actually consider it as, is this a below the waterline decision, in which case I'll be a little bit more risk averse, or is it above the waterline decision? Meaning if I make this decision and unfortunately a torpedo hits the boat, the boat just doesn't look quite as good. And, that's the key is, trying to understand. And for some people, their risk tolerance is such that everything is an above the waterline decision, and for others, it's quite the opposite. Everything's a below the waterline decision. And I think over the course of your lifetime, you get wiser. Wisdom is, based upon the school of hard knocks, and our painful life lessons are often the raw material for our future wisdom. And you get better at discerning what's an above the waterline decision and what's below. And starting a boutique hotel company at 26 in San Francisco, where the risk tolerance is high for people and having a potential failure is not going to sink me, it felt like an above the waterline decision. But then there's been other times when I frankly wished I had realized it was a below the waterline decision because it was a big deal, and I undervalued the risk associated.
I often tell students, nobody gets to our station, your and my station in life in terms of our age, our experience, and says, gosh, I took too much risk. Almost everybody wished they had tried more things and experimented more. And I think you really have to think about what is under the water and what's above the water. And I think often everyone thinks things are below the water when they might be actually above the water.
Yeah. So the thing I like to say to my teams that, over the course of 24 years of running Joie De Vivre, we created 52 boutique hotels and more than 20 restaurants and about 5 spas. So the thing I always ask is, if in the launch of this hotel or restaurant or spa, what are the 5 most likely points of failure or likely areas where we're not going to succeed? What's going to come up? And then I want my general manager or my senior team to have a plan B, a plan C for each of those five. And I think that kind of scenario planning is really helpful. Yes, there are times when the thing that is the biggest risk you don't even see, and it's not in your top 5 list. You have a blind spot to it. But being able to acknowledge what the potential risks are and how you might mitigate those risks. And then also seeing, hey, number 2 on my list of risks, I don't have a mitigation. So that might actually then say like, wow, it's the second most likely scenario of what could happen, but I'm now moving it to my number 1 risk, because if that does happen, I actually don't have a backup plan. And that actually could get me to a place of saying, I'm not going to do this, because that's a pretty serious thing. And so, I do think that kind of, planning, that scenario planning is really helpful.
So Chip, one of your hotels that became famous in the Bay Area, and I know this because I lived there, was the Hotel Vitale. And that was just an amazing spot. I went there multiple times myself. That's a key piece of land. There must have been some negotiations in competing for that site. Any stories there?
Yeah, we were competing with Kimpton. It was owned, the land was owned by the city of San Francisco. So it was going to be a 65-year land lease. So we really needed to get inside the head of the decision makers in San Francisco, the elected officials, to see what was going to be important to them. Yes, the amount of rent we were going to pay over 65 years for the land lease was going to be important. But this was a parcel that was also had some history to it that a lot of people didn't know. It was the parcel across the street from where the longshoremen's strike had happened in 1935, I believe. That is a pivotal part of union history, not just in San Francisco, but in the whole country. And so being that San Francisco is a relatively progressive city, and we knew that the hotel union was going to do everything in their power to make sure that this was a union hotel. We didn't have much of a relationship with the hotel union. Most of our hotels were non-union. Kimpton was, almost essentially non-union as well. So one of the negotiating beliefs we had was that allying ourselves with the union would probably be helpful, because the city's going to actually look kindly on this being a union hotel. Kimpton didn't want to do that because they felt like it might, infect their company. We, on the other hand, felt like we had a really great culture, and having a union hotel would not be a problem. But the thing that Kimpton just didn't even get was on this parcel of land, a little bit further away from the actual, the bay, which is the bayfront. But still on this piece of land, there was a historical sculpture that had been there for decades. It wasn't very pretty, quite frankly, and Kimpton was going to remove it from the site and move it somewhere else. But it was a historical sculpture of the longshoremen's strike. So it had a huge value to the union for historical reasons. And we could actually design and architect our hotel around the piece of this piece of sculpture. And so that's what we did. We not only said that we are willing to negotiate with the union to make it a union hotel, and we would actually figure out how to improve our margins. We actually ended up paying less in our proposal to the city of San Francisco than Kimpton was going to pay, partly because our margins are going to be lower with being a union hotel. But because we were going to be a union hotel and the city liked that, and because we said that we would actually not move the sculpture, we would design the hotel around the sculpture and give some attention to the sculpture, we won the negotiations with the city, and the city signed a 65-year lease with us.
That's amazing.
It just shows that sometimes you have to look for the intangible things that are not obvious that the decision maker is going to use in their decision-making process.
So in the end, it was as much about the sculpture as anything, and people are probably poring over spreadsheets and trying to figure out different angles, but the sculpture was the story in this case.
It really was, and the sculpture was not on any spreadsheet, and quite frankly, the architects, when I told the architects we had to work around the sculpture, they said, well, that's very doable, but it's such an ugly sculpture. And I said, you're right. It's really not a beautiful sculpture. And yet it's a sculpture that has an incredible history to it. And so we've got to work with it.
It's a fantastic story. Well, you mentioned the kind of .com, both boom and then crisis. I've stayed in a lot of hotels, and I've often thought it's a lot of employees to manage through different business cycles. And so maybe talk about how many employees you had, and were there cycles like the dot-com bust where you had to either lay people off or manage through cycles? And what are the negotiations involved there? Any stories?
Yeah. So we went through the dot-com bust. So interestingly, back to the Vitale story, we won our contract in, I think, 1999 or 2000. And so now we had to figure out how to finance the hotel. We had our equity partner, but we needed to get debt. And the dot-com bust was starting in 2000. And my God, we ended up having to put the whole project on mothballs for about 3 years because, quite frankly, there was no financing for new hotels because the dot-com bust and 9/11 happened. And so because of all that, we were in a position where, I had to figure out how to save the company during the worst of times. And one of the things I could see was that I didn't want to lay our employees off. We had a really great culture, and I invested in the culture. And to have people lose their jobs just because of economic reasons, not because of their own performance, felt like it would hurt the culture. So I went to my senior leaders in the company who were making, very good salaries. And I said, I'd like to have our senior leaders take a 20% pay cut of their salary. And that might last as long as 2 or 3 years. And I wanted all of the managers, anybody who is salaried in the company, to take a 10% pay cut. And I also wanted to move the company's health insurance such that the core health insurance that we would pay for would be from Kaiser, an HMO, which is less expensive than a PPO, which, gives you a lot of different choices. People could still do the PPO, but we only would subsidize the HMO, what would be comparable to the HMO cost. So we were going to do all those three things, 20% pay cut for senior people, 10% pay cut for anybody who is salaried and a manager, and then the shift in health insurance. But by doing that, it meant I didn't have to do any layoffs. Our competitors, Kimpton, Ian Schrager, Marriott, Hilton, on average, had to cut 15% of their workers, housekeepers, bartenders, etc. And it damaged the culture so much that actually what we found was people flocked to our company and were open to being paid less. Our pay scale, first of all, our health insurance was maybe less generous, and our pay scale was maybe 40 to 50th percentile. But because people had job security and they had a sense that we cared about our employees, and we still invested in culture, we became the number one employer in terms of employee satisfaction in San Francisco, not just in the hospitality industry, but in the overall industry of all San Francisco employers. And that had a huge impact on our employee satisfaction and then our guest satisfaction. So during that time, during the dot-com bust, not only did we see our employees were happy and our customers were happy, but we grew market share, and 75% of our hotels grew market share in a difficult time, which is unusual for independent or boutique hotels. Usually the big chain hotels gain market share in a downturn. So long story short is, making those, negotiating those kinds of changes. And we didn't lose a single person as a result of those three changes. We didn't lose managers because, quite frankly, managers, have savings, whereas line level employees often don't.
Yeah. Wow, what a good story. It's you essentially were negotiating culture there. I learned the hard way in my career that I always thought that if you paid people more, they'd be more loyal. And that's just not to be true. Situations where you were wiser than I was as a manager of giving them agency, giving them security, giving them extra things that weren't necessarily salaried, but were maybe even more valuable. You effectively negotiated long-term employment. And that's just an inspiring story. I could ask you 100 more stories about Joie De Vivre, but then we wouldn't get to your other careers.
Yes.
And so we're going to shift in a minute to your important role at Airbnb. Ironically, having run a boutique hotel, and then eventually, the story goes that you sold the chain and did very well financially. But the Airbnb founders saw that in you and saw you as a potential mentor and brought you in. But before we go there, you did a 2-year hiatus between selling Joie De Vivre and starting at Airbnb. What'd you do for those 2 years? What was your walkabout?
I was, after 24 years of, being on the treadmill, I had 2 years to just be curious. And there were three things I was curious about. Number one, I was curious about hot springs, the geothermal aspects of it, and I went around the world to a bunch of hot springs. Secondly, I was interested in emotions because, frankly, in the Great Recession, I'd really felt like some dark emotions, and I wrote a book called Emotional Equations that became a New York Times bestseller. But the big thing I did is I was studying festivals. I was the first board member of Burning Man. Who knew Burning Man had a board? And I decided I wanted to create a website of the 300 best festivals in the world. 300. It was called Fest 300. So I went around the world to a bunch of festivals. But one of the things I did for Burning Man is I knew that Burning Man was in a negotiating difficult position with BLM, the Bureau of Land Management. So the annual Burning Man event in the desert in northern Nevada is on federal land. And the bigger the event got, the more negotiating leverage BLM had against Burning Man. So one of the things that I knew as a board member was that there was this other lot, about 3,400 acres, not too far from Burning Man, that back in 1996, Burning Man actually did their event there in a year where they were in negotiating challenges with BLM. So I knew that this land was available for sale. I also knew that, frankly, if we bought that land, it would give us leverage with our negotiations with the BLM. We didn't necessarily want to move the Burning Man Festival over to this, what was called Fly Ranch, but we wanted the leverage, and this Fly Ranch property was just spectacular in all kinds of other ways. So I went out and I made a commitment, a large commitment myself, but I helped get Sergey Brin, Elon Musk, Joe Gebbia from Airbnb to put up what ultimately was about $7 or $8 million for us to buy this land. And in so doing, it gave us the negotiating leverage with BLM, which was very helpful because, quite frankly, at that point, this was, around 2012, maybe 2013. Burning Man had become a global cultural phenomena, and it was selling out every year, and it was just packed. And the more successful we got, the more BLM could negotiate all kinds of additional costs and other, sometimes unreasonable things. So it helped us in our negotiations, and I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it because I love Burning Man, and I loved the fact that this was a pretty savvy way of BLM realizing that we had another option.
Amazing. I literally was giving a talk last night on negotiation, and someone asked, what are the key things that you need to know going into negotiation to develop? And one I said is get leverage. And leverage you've defined as having an alternative. If you had to walk away from the BLM, what you were walking to got better and better, and it made it harder for them. And so I think people don't often think about actively working to improve their walk-away alternative, which you wisely did there. So I think that's a great story. I spent most of my career in the Bay Area, so Burning Man obviously was something that lots of us talked about and had fun thinking about. There were always crazy stories. I mean, for those that haven't been to Burning Man, there's no exchange of monetary goods. People are really living freely there. Any stories of crazy things that happened with guests? You as a kind of on the governance, on the board side, must have at sometimes been worried and nervous about things that might take place there. Any negotiations there?
Yeah, I mean, we did have to negotiate as board members, directors and officers, insurance, because, you don't necessarily want to be a board member of an organization that has a lot of fire attached to it. And a lot of people, frankly, at times, taking psychedelics and, getting in trouble and getting hurt. So, yeah, I mean, we did have to negotiate that. But I mean, I would just say the experience of Burning Man, when you have a culture, Brian Chesky, founder of Airbnb, when the first time he ever went to Burning Man was when I joined Airbnb. And he said, this is the way the world would be like if artists ruled the world. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. When you have a community of 80,000 people, a utopian community where money is not the currency, but, it's a gift economy and you're giving things to people, it's interesting where negotiation sort of goes by the wayside a little bit. I mean, you just are, you sort of lead with love. It's sort of like going to Cuba. You've go to Cuba. Cuba has a terrible economy, and it's just awful, in many kinds of ways. But the people of Cuba just love it. And in some ways, and Cuba's sort of like a gifting economy because their currency doesn't mean much, and making money doesn't mean much there. And so instead, they love music, and they love partying, and they love, storytelling. And so when you take money away from an environment, it is interesting what comes in its place. And that's really what Burning Man is about. And I can tell you all kinds of stories, including famous people who I've partied with at Burning Man. But what's more important is just the basic ethic, the ethos of Burning Man, which is to say, how can we be human without money as the currency? And, lots of interesting, magical things happen as a result of that.
Money is usually a part of commercial negotiations. And one thing I advise, students and clients over the years is to try to postpone the discussion of money until you've talked about other things, some of the creative problem solving that we referred to earlier. Because once you talk about money, it's hard to talk about anything else. It becomes the thing. And since it's never the only thing, I just recommend that people postpone the discussion of money.
Build trust first. I mean, you build trust in relationship first. And I've seen that actually. I wrote a letter to the woman who is buying my home this week. And I really wanted her to understand how much I love that home and some of the nuances of the home. Because, we got an appraisal of the home, and the appraisal, and she's buying it all cash. So she didn't have to have an appraisal. It wasn't a lender appraisal. And I think it was a negotiating tool on her part. So to tell the appraiser, be very cautious. And when I saw the appraisal and some of the assumptions, I was like, this is not right. And so I needed to tell her I was not going to drop the price to the appraised price because I thought it was a negotiating tool. I didn't say that part. But I said, here's why I think this is worth more than that. And I gave both a logical left brain perspective, which made some sense. But I also gave her the right brain perspective I knew that she could have horses on this property, and there really wasn't another property nearby that could have 6.5 acres on a creek that her horses could live in. And I knew there were a bunch of other things, and there were stories that she probably didn't know about in terms of what happened when this house, which has been around for 150 years, she just didn't know these things. So I wanted her to see some of the intangible value of the home. And guess what? I did have to take my price down a little bit, but I only reduced the price to it was a $75,000 price difference she wanted. And I gave her $20,000, and we agreed on that.
Excellent. Well, let's transition to Airbnb. It sounds like from Burning Man, knew that some of the founders. You stepped into a company that had gotten off the ground, but probably needed some, quote, adult supervision. I've heard you referred to Airbnb as everything from the Secretary of State to the chief problem solver, and there had to be a lot of negotiation. So talk about what you stepped into. There was a group of founders. What did you find when you stepped in?
Well, I got a call from Brian Chesky 13 years ago. He was the co-founder and CEO of Airbnb, and he asked me if I wanted to help him democratize hospitality. At that point, Airbnb was not a household word. I mean, some millennials had heard of it, and it had grown globally, but most people had never heard of it, including myself. I mean, I'd heard of it, but I'd never used it. And when Brian told me a little bit more about the business idea, I was like, oh, this is a terrible idea, Brian. That's never going to work. Yeah. He said, let me show you the numbers. It's working. And so I joined at 52 years old. The average age in the company was 26. I was a hotelier. I was the only person in the company who had a hospitality or travel background. It was a tiny company. And what I realized pretty quickly was, wow, I thought they needed me for my hospitality background, but they really needed me for my entrepreneurship and leadership background and culture. How do you build a culture in a company? I'd written a book called Peak, How Great Companies Get Their Mojo from Maslow. And the three founders said, we want to be a peak company. So they started calling me the modern elder. I was like, I don't like that because it makes me feel old. But then they said, Chip, you're as curious as you are wise. And we think a modern elder is someone who's got the perfect alchemy of curiosity and wisdom. But what I really helped them to see, I think, pretty quickly was they were operating the business week to week. And they had some venture capitalists who were very focused on creating long-term value, but they had these business plans that they were meeting. The growth, the hockey stick of growth was there. But nobody had ever asked them, including their venture capitalists, Brian, if we're this successful and we keep this path of growth going, 3 years from now, we're going to be a large company. And there are a lot of people who will be disrupting, who will be pissed off. How are we going to deal with the hoteliers or the unions or the Convention and Visitors Bureau or corporate travel managers who are trying to keep their employees safe on the road or who are going to be staying in an Airbnb? What are the things we're going to do? And Brian said, I'd never thought of that, and so I said, like, we should start to look at how are we open to being regulated? And he said, like, no way. The VCs will not like that. Like, we don't want regulation. I was like, well, you're going to be regulated. But the question is, are you going to be part of the municipality who's going to regulate you? And we're going to have to pay occupancy taxes just like a hotel does, which is not paid by us. It's actually just the guests pay it. But we got to collect it and pay it to the municipalities. So Arthur Brooks wrote the book From Strength to Strength. He's on our faculty at the Modern Elder Academy. And what he says is that as we get older, we move from fluid intelligence, being fast and focused and very, very linear in our thinking, to thinking holistically and having crystallized intelligence and connecting the dots, thinking holistically and systemically. And that is really what I offered at Airbnb, is I helped them to see if we're going to grow into the company that ultimately is the most valuable hospitality company in the world, which is what happened when we had our IPO 7.5 years after I joined the company. We are going to have to think long-term. And, thank God, Brian listened. And yes, it was, the regulation piece of Airbnb still is a vexing problem for the company. But we would never have grown to the company and the reputation we had if I think we hadn't thought in the long term about some of the things, some of the people we're going to have to negotiate with. And we don't want to negotiate with them at a point when they are angry and not feeling like we are respectful of the disruption we're doing. So we needed to be, a hospitality disruptor, which is a funny oxymoron, because hospitality is all about being gracious and friendly and in serving the world. And the disruption piece often feels like it can lead to people being pissed off.
I remember reading about struggles Airbnb was having. I think it might have been New York City. There was some resistance there. And before we get to that story, love to talk about, the co-founder relationship. I think there were 4 co-founders. Did they all work seamlessly together? Did they all have similar strengths? Were they complementary? How did you help them figure out how they related to each other in that co-founding role?
Yeah, there were 3 really. There was Joe and Brian, who were the first founders, and then they brought Nate in. And Joe and Brian were designers, and they had one point of view of the world, and Nate was an engineer. And when I joined the company, the 3 of them were sort of a little bit, they had their own points of view, but Joe and Brian, as both designers from the Rhode Island School of Design, they saw the world very similarly. But Nate was very different. And there were times I felt like Brian and Joe didn't give Nate the proper credit he needed. Nate was very important in the company because actually this is a tech company. So one of the things I suggested in one of our first offsite retreats with the leadership team when I joined the company was that we would do Myers-Briggs tests, personality tests. And the reason I suggested that was partly because I had this belief that Brian was probably the opposite of Nate. And as it turns out, there are 16 different types of personalities in Myers-Briggs, and they were exact opposites. And when they learned that, and when over the course of a 3-day offsite retreat, they started to understand the synergistic relationship they could have, Brian and Nate in particular, it actually created an enormous bond that they didn't have before. Brian knew that Nate helped him with the blind spots that sometimes Brian was missing. Brian was missing the process orientation of an engineer, and that's what Nate was. Nate was missing the big picture and the vision that Brian could see, and the UX, the user experience part of the website that Brian was so good at. So in many ways, I helped, in the early days of the company, create an environment where the three founders could stay actively involved to the point where they were all three billionaires. And there's really never been a founder trio that stayed together for almost a dozen years. And Joe is still on the board, but not at all involved in day-to-day anymore. But you've never seen a trio that actually have stayed together. And frankly, Brian, to his credit, and the number one thing I thought my role was I had lots of things I was doing in the company, but I wanted Brian to be successful as leader. And he is the only corporate CEO on the Fortune 500 who doesn't have a business or legal background. He has no business background at all. And he's the only creative, the person who comes from the creative world, who's actually a CEO on the Fortune 500. So, that was in many ways what I tried to do, but negotiating with Brian along the way to have him realize that he needed to grow into being a leader if he's going to be running a public company, at times was hard because there were times I was reporting to Brian as well. He was my mentee, but I was the head of global hospitality and strategy. So sometimes my persuasion had to come from a place of having him see the long term and not the short term.
I love that. And I love that they, stuck together. And I didn't know that they were the only ones that achieved that level of financial success. It's not at all surprising because I find that most co-founders, either they evolve differently, they contribute differently, conflict arises and they divide. The ones that I've seen work well typically have either a coach or a mentor like you, or someone to help them with the inevitable differences that happen in the part of a high growth, high friction company. And so I'm sure you played a big role in that. Let's turn to regulation. Am I correct in my memory that New York City was tough? Were you part of that?
Yeah, New York City was tough, even before I ever joined the company. And Paris was tough. And Paris, we made some good progress on. New York, we didn't actually. But even though we made small progress along the way, I actually think Airbnb is going to make a comeback in New York, partly because hotels have become way too expensive in New York without having Airbnb be there. Airbnb is there. It's just much smaller than it used to be. The number one thing we had to do with the regulators and the negotiations was to bring hosts to tell their stories. I mean, it's one thing to be a tech firm that's VC backed from San Francisco. That's not necessarily going to persuade the mayor of Paris or New York. But what's going to persuade the powers that be was personal stories often people who were similar in age. So the thing that a lot of people didn't know about Airbnb was a millennial thing. It was a millennial thing for who the guests were. Millennials' travel habits. They liked Airbnb. It helped them to live like a local, have more space for less money. But what a lot of people didn't know is that the fastest growing age demographic of Airbnb hosts were people who were 50 and older. And I was 50 and older. And guess what? The mayors of these places and a lot of the legislatures and the regulators were 50 and older. So having Brian show up at age 31 or 32 as, sort of this hoodie wearing CEO of a tech company wasn't going to help persuade them. What would persuade them is me showing up as the Secretary of State occasionally and our policy team that was an older group of people generally, and then the hosts who happened to be older. And having someone to come in and say, you know what, I had a heart attack and my wife and I had to leave the workplace. And the way we're actually supplementing our Social Security is by actually being Airbnb hosts and renting out the cottage in the backyard. And then having more and more of those stories. And that worked in many, many communities. Now, the truth is, over time, as Airbnb got really big, you started having property managers on the platform. And that became a little bit of a problem for us because the storyline, the narrative we had was at odds with the fastest growing demographic, which happened to be property managers who are sometimes taking affordable housing off the market to turn it into overnight Airbnb listings. And frankly, at times we had to be at odds with our property manager hosts. But the thing I learned in negotiating with our hosts is that they had to trust that we had their best interests at heart. And that frankly, that we wanted to make them better hosts. When I joined Airbnb, the quality control at Airbnb wasn't very good. By the time I left, Airbnb had higher guest satisfaction ratings than the hotel industry, by far, actually. And part of that was helping hosts realize that our system, a hotel doesn't have a good feedback loop with customers. But Airbnb as a tech platform where people were giving 70% of hosts and guests were giving reviews and helping on a daily basis a host understand what could have been better, and then helping us have tools to help educate hosts how they could be better at what they do and how they could become a super host. And by being a super host, they got a bunch of other benefits. So what we did is we actually had a very difficult challenge, which was the hosts are not our employees. In a hotel, I was used to having my employees providing the service. But, the people who were providing the service were these entrepreneurs who are Airbnb hosts who were not our employees. So creating a dashboard for the hosts to know how they could do better by doing better, they got more money, became super hosts. We actually profiled hosts in all kinds of public ways. And we had an annual Airbnb Open. We had 20,000 hosts from 110 countries come to the annual Airbnb Open we would do. That was like a festival of hosting. So long story short is, you try to do things that are in the best interest of people. And if you do that well, it can work well for both them and for you.
That's amazing. We could do a whole hour on your experiences at Airbnb, but I want to move on to the next thing because you once again reinvented yourself again. And there is a through line between these three things that you created amazing innovation in all. But the final one was something called the Modern Elder Academy, which you currently run. Tell people why you founded it and what it does first before we dive into the negotiations.
Yeah, when I was in my 50s at Airbnb, when I was in my late 40s, I was struggling. I sold, Joie De Vivre it's now Hyatt brand. I sold it, at the bottom of the Great Recession because I just didn't want to do it anymore. And I had in the U curve of happiness research shows that 45 to 50 is a really rough time in people's lives. But I then found my 50s to be amazing. I loved them. And I was like, I wish somebody in my late 40s had told me 50s was going to be great. So I also saw that in a lot of my friends who struggled in the late 40s, got into their 50s, but also women felt invisible, men felt irrelevant. And a lot of people felt like they didn't know what the roadmap for living their 50s, 60s, and beyond would be. And so the Modern Elder Academy, doubling down on what the founders of Airbnb called me, was the world's first midlife wisdom school. And it's been around now for 8 years. We have 8,000 alumni from 60 countries, and we have 56 regional chapters around the world. As the world's first midlife wisdom school, we help people often in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, navigate the transitions of midlife, cultivate a new sense of purpose, learn how to own their wisdom, and reframe their relationship with getting older. Because Becca Levy at Yale has shown that when you reframe your relationship with aging from a negative to a positive and see the upside of aging, you gain 7.5 years of extended longevity. So that's really what MEA is. It has a campus in Baja on the beach, an hour north of Cabo San Lucas, and then a campus where I am right now, a 2,600-acre regenerative horse ranch campus in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And then we have online programs, and we also even have residential communities. So I love what I'm doing today. It is a combination of my hospitality background, since these are residential retreats. But it's combined with wellness, and I was on the board of the Esalen Institute in Big Sur for 10 years. So it's the most famous retreat center. So it's a retreat center. It's sort of like Four Seasons meets blue zones, the longevity folks, meets the Esalen Institute. And very proud of the fact that it's making a difference in people's lives.
You mentioned that you liked, geothermal tubs. I think the geothermal experience at the Esalen Institute, for anyone who hasn't been there, has to be maybe the best in the world. Have you ever been anywhere that has a better setting and situation than Esalen?
That's the best. It is the best.
Yeah, it's amazing. I actually got engaged there. Let's drill down a little bit. You and I have talked about this. People are coming to the Modern Elder Academy to essentially negotiate their identity. Sometimes they're transitioning from employment, a job, and trying to decide, in your words, what a calling might be instead of a job. How do you help them? Give us some of the methodology. How do you help them negotiate that transition?
Well, the truth is, when someone's going through a challenge, maybe a midlife transition, and it was involuntary, they're more negotiable.
Yeah.
They've lost a job, they've gotten divorced, they've had a cancer diagnosis, they're an empty nester and they're struggling. There's a lot of transitions that happen in midlife. And when people are going through something that's involuntary, they're a little more open to shifting their habits. And this is part of the reason why a residential retreat is important, because if you want to change your habits, you sometimes have to change your habitat. And so in a course of a 5-day workshop, we get pretty intense in a deep, positive way. But they also realize in a group of, let's say, 24 people that they're going through a workshop with, that they're not the only one. And then they also have to ask the question, one of my favorite questions that I like to bring up to people in our workshops is, 10 years from now, what will you regret if you don't learn it or do it now? And that's a really great question because, anticipated regret is a form of wisdom. And, again, focusing on the future self and who you want to be in the future does require sometimes some changes of who you are today. And like I said, someone who's going through an involuntary transition may be more open to that because, guess what? I got fired or I sold my company and I'm 55 years old and I'm going to live another 40 years. I don't want to be playing golf and, playing bingo. And so there's a sense that people are more open to change when they are unhappy with the transition they're in. When you're going through a voluntary transition, sometimes you're more open to a transition also because you got divorced by your choice or you sold your company by your choice and you're like, want to do something new. So the key is to help people to see that future self and what you want that person to be. And Erik Erikson, the famous developmental psychologist, said, "I am what survives me." And as people get older, it's less about the ego, it's more about the legacy, but not the ego-driven legacy, but like the influence and the impact you have. You move from return on investment ROI to ripples of impact ROI. And so we help people, start to get clear on the fact that, as David Brooks wrote about in The Second Mountain, in the second half of your life, it's not the resume or your LinkedIn profile that's important. It's the eulogy that ultimately some people are your friends are going to say about you. So that kind of thinking helps people to make some of the identity shifts they need to make.
Love that. I love that you quoted Erik Erikson and David Brooks, two of my favorites. Erik Erikson, prominent throughout the 40s and 50s and 60s. And so a lot of young people wouldn't know about him, but his both stages of development framework and his book on society had a huge impact on me. And then David Brooks, in addition to, his book that you referenced, his newer book called How to Know a Person, which is sitting on my desk here, is just, I think he's one of our great thinkers about modern society. So I love it that you referred to them. I'm thinking as you're talking about the issue that a lot of people, you referenced that people are going to live longer. And a lot of people either transition out, as you say, voluntarily or involuntarily from their jobs in their 40s and 50s, and might find it hard to find employment. I've felt like that group of people, having all the wisdom, has a hard time getting a job. And so it must be part of your methodology and systems there to help those folks negotiate, in effect, their value to society.
Yeah.
What are some of the things you've learned about that?
Well, helping people to understand the wisdom they have, because, a resume tells you one thing, but a case study, and case studies that actually amplify the intangible wisdom that you can offer is really important. This is why Arthur Brooks and his book From Strength to Strength is a core part of our program, because it helps people to see like, wow, I do have value. And intergenerational teams, we talk about diversity in the workplace, and it's very valuable. There's a lot of data that supports that. But intergenerational diversity on teams is particularly valuable. And that's because the young brain and the older brain operate differently. So helping people to see what gets better with age, the fact that our EQ grows with age, the fact that, Viktor Frankl's famous quote, between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and our freedom. So as we get older, we are less emotionally reactive. We think holistically. And so being able to talk about case studies of what you've done in the workplace that has been valuable to your workmates and the company can show your invisible productivity. Productivity, the way we think of it today is like, how many widgets did, the worker make in an hour? But that's a very industrial model. Invisible productivity speaks to this idea that you make everybody around you better just by you being there. And we know players on sports teams that do that, especially in basketball. Sometimes a player who's an amazing player, but a terrible teammate, they don't do well in the NFL draft or the NBA draft, or, they're traded from team to team to team because nobody wants to play with them. So how do you help show yourself as that team player who actually makes everybody else around them better? So we have tangible tools and specific practical ways for people to see how do you articulate your wisdom and the case studies of how you've done that in the workplace. So it's beautiful, because actually what it does is it helps people to have the confidence to go out there and look for a job or find a co-founder because they can see their value. As we get older, it's not about being youthful anymore. It's about being useful, and helping people to see their utility is essential.
I love that. We can unpack so many things you say. I want to hit on the Viktor Frankl quote, because as I listen to that, it's fundamentally about agency and picking what you do and feeling empowered, and the fact that you are helping people see their usefulness and their utility and getting them in society in a way that's healthy for them and frankly helpful for the people around them, all their relationships, is a great service. So thank you for doing that. And of course, we'll put links in the show notes to, there are probably going to be 30 links in the show notes for all the great things that Chip has done. If we listed all of your books, your podcast, and we haven't even really mentioned that, but you referred to your podcast that you do several times a week, which is called The Midlife Chrysalis. That is an amazing podcast. In preparation for this, I listened to multiple episodes. So you're not only a great interviewee, you're a great interviewer. And that might be a good place for us to stop. But it's just been such a pleasure to reconnect on this. And thank you for all that you're doing for all those around you.
Thank you. Stan, the loyalty you've paid and the impact you've had, the ripples of impact you've had to all the students and all your clients is so notable. And there are going to be a lot of people at your funeral is giving good Stan stories.
Let's hope that's not soon.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope it's not.
All right. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to All Things Negotiation. Please subscribe to the show on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube. If you enjoyed the show, tell a friend, and be sure to engage with us on social media. Your likes, comments, and reposts make a big difference and help others find the show. The show was produced by Ezra Trupiano, original music by Peter Breinhold, and designed by Aubrey Benson. Thanks for listening.